How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your sticking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Ben. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare.
So we're starting this episode, and Justin just broke the news that the Mighty Mighty Boss Tones just broke up.
I can't.
Todd's devastated.
Somebody didn't knock on wood when they predicted. I was trying to think of a clever joke.
That wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad joke.
Does the movie strike you as a little rapey?
No, I don't know.
This is just how I have sex.
Okay.
No, but hey, guys, before we roll into the movie, I do, and this episode's already going to be long, but I just want to introduce you to something that the wife gave me right before I came in, and I thought that she was like, "I thought you might like this," and I was like it, I love it, especially
an
for
STD?
the podcast. It is an STD. Thank you, Todd, for passing that. You ruined it. The surprise is over. I'm going to show you guys my herpes. No, this book, How to Reach Your Favorite Star 2.
Oh, is that Joey Lawrence on there?
There's Joey Lawrence.
Miam Bialik.
Yeah.
Miam.
Chris Cross is down there.
Crisscross.
Well, one of them's dead, I think, now. So
This will be fun.
So you're going to need a Ouija board and some candles.
Open to
lock
a
of his
random
hair.
page. I'm going to start flipping through. Tell me when to stop.
Stop.
All right. Oh, this is a good one right off the bat. It's Edward Furlong.
Hey!
Oh.
Eddie.
So it has like super stats. He was raised in Glendale, California. Current residence, Highland, California. Raised by his Aunt Nancy and Uncle Sean. Interests, surfing, skateboarding, motorbike riding, using a video camera. Personal style, t-shirt, button-down shirt, jeans, and boots.
Wow. So the Eddie Vedder school of fashion.
Yeah.
He's going.
He has a pet named Puzzle. It's a cat.
Not
Favorite
anymore.
food is cheeseburgers and fries. Favorite movies,
He's so
Aliens,
original.
and all scary movies in general.
Wait, Alien or Aliens?
Yes, Aliens.
Oh, he's just sucking up to James Cameron because he's working for him.
Good point. Cool credits. Films: Terminator 2, Judgment Day, Pet Sematary 2, American Heart, and A Home of Our Own. When he was a preteen, the last thing Eddie Furlong thought about was an acting career. Clearly. Now, one day, while he and his new friends were hanging outside the boys' club in Pasadena, California, a casting director noticed Edward and thought he'd be perfect in pictures. Eddie auditioned and got a role in Terminator 2, Judgment Day. And when you're good, one part leads to another. Now it's tutoring on the set and mega bucks for this talented boy.
I want them to do a follow-up to all of these.
Birthday
like
beat
30 years later.
August 2nd, 1977. So you want to know, there's a section that says that about Edward's first meeting with the big guy, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The two shook hands, and in his thick Austrian accent, Arnold said to Eddie, "Shake harder." From then on, showing his playful side, Eddie would repeat Arnold's first words to him, accent and all. "Shake harder, duh." That's
Did he do that when he was like taking a piss?
If you want to reach Edward Furlong, P.O. Box 90666, Pasadena, California, 91106.
Let's write to it.
Oh, yeah.
Some poor person has that P.O. box now, and it's forever published in that book. Or it's still Eddie Furlong's. Who knows?
It could be.
It could be. It could still be.
He walks there every day in his
Every day.
bathrobe.
Just looking for fan mail.
Just
That sad music from Charlie Brown, like playing as he walks up to it.
door opens. Just,
Well, unlocks it.
nothing again.
Closes it.
Nothing Just like- Once in a blue moon, he gets a fan letter from the one guy who likes the Crow movie that he's in.
Oh yeah, it's definitely, it's like the Eddie Furlong stands on Twitter or whatever that have something to say on every post he makes. I don't even know if he has a Twitter, but yeah. Anyway,
That was good. Thank you for that, Gary. Thank you for that bit of just I don't know what to call it. Let's start the show.
Well, hello and welcome to Cinema Shock. It's the podcast that explores the stories behind your favorite cult and genre films and celebrates the artists who create them. That feels new. This is wait, no, Todd's going to tell you what this is. I'm one of your hosts, Gary Horne.
Hey, I'm Justin Bishop.
And I'm your third wheel writer, comedian, Mr. Todd Davis. And welcome to part one of our coverage of the bloody and visceral films in the early career of Mr. David Cronenberg in a series we've titled The New Flesh, the body horror of David Cronenberg.
That's it. Thank you, Todd.
Yeah, thank you.
You're getting good at these intros.
Thanks.
We're talking about David Cronenberg. Finally, we've mentioned him on the show quite a few times. Actually, he's come up on like Total Recall. I think he was up for. I feel like he's come up on a few other episodes, a couple times during the Paul Verhoeven series, if I remember right. But now we figured we've referenced him enough that it's time to really just dig deep into to his career, because he is a master of horror. Even though he's kind of moved on from the genre at this point in his career, he'll always be known as like a horror movie director simply based on those first few films.
You say that, but of course you mean as a horror director, because I just watched the series Slasher, and he has a huge role in the new series. So he's still hanging out. He's helping out his fellow Canadians.
Oh yeah, and his son, of course, has gone on to become a pretty well-renowned horror movie director.
That movie was pretty sick.
Possessor, it's fucking awesome. So David Cronenberg has been called many things. He's been called the Baron of Blood, the King of Venereal Horror. I read an interview where he was called that, and he's like, it's a small kingdom, but I'll take it.
It's one of the boxes you check at the free clinic, right?
Venereal horror.
You have venereal horror.
What are you here for?
It's what's next to Todd's yearbook photo.
The Village Voice once called him the most audacious and challenging narrative director in the English-speaking world. And his films they've polarized both critics and audiences. They've repulsed, they've wowed, they've been booed, they've won awards. Crash, one of my favorite things was that Crash in 1996. I don't know if you guys have seen Crash. We'll get to it on a future series, but incredible, visceral, psychosexual thriller that came out in 1996. It was awarded the special jury prize at the Cannes Film Festival, which is a prize that they only give out when the jury feels like this deserves some sort of award. And they gave it for, it's a quote from them, originality, daring, and for audacity. I think audacity is something that's going to come up a lot in David Cronenberg's films as we discuss them. His films often explore body transformation, technology, infection, sexuality, and the intertwining of the psychological with the physical. And his career has had several distinct phases, but his name will always kind of be synonymous with body horror. This is a subgenre that he helped to define as the subgenre that helped to kick off his filmmaking career. There was a run of films that he made early in his career that culminated with one of the greatest, if not the greatest, body horror film of all time, which is 1986's The Fly. So in this series, that's specifically what we're going to talk about. We're not going through all of Cronenberg's filmography this go around. Trust me, I want to get to his later stuff. I want to get to Naked Lunch and Crash and A History of Violence. We're going to get to those sometime down the line. But for this series, we're going to explore that stretch of his career where he was making those body horror movies that he would become known for. And we're starting all the way back at the beginning with his very first body horror film, 1975's Shivers.
If you think you're not afraid of the dark, if you think you have a strong stomach, if you feel nothing can shock you, if you say you don't scare easily, if you believe you've seen everything, then prepare yourself for a motion picture that takes you beyond fear, beyond your wildest nightmares, and brings you face to face with terror, beyond the power of priest or science to exorcise. What are they? raging demons from another world, bloodthirsty creatures that must be killed, or incarnations of absolute evil. They possess men, women, and children, and drive them to acts of unbelievable horror. No one is safe from them. No power on earth can stop them. The only escape is death. If this picture doesn't make you scream and squirm, you'd better see a psychiatrist. Quick.
David Cronenberg was born on March 15th, 1943, to a Jewish middle-class family in Toronto. And he came from a family of artists and intellectuals. His mother, Esther, was a pianist. His father, Milton, was a freelance writer. And his older sister, Denise, was a ballet dancer. So he's got a bunch of artists in his family.
Sorry that Todd, on our Zoom meeting here, had to snicker at pianist. I was very professional and I wasn't going to snicker, but then
saying like she knows her way around a piano. She's a really good pianist.
Oh God. This is
really she keeps a good grip on it.
I hope people are tuning in for significant.
Have you ever watched anyone play a piano?
Do you know what a piano is?
Do you know what a piano looks like, Todd?
It's where you
Are you riding a motorcycle? And that seems to be the.
It's both hands like this, but on wieners.
Oh. Hey.
Wow.
I'm sorry.
The piano lessons in Todd's childhood home must have been very interesting. So Cronenberg's childhood was fairly uneventful. He was a good student. He enjoyed watching films. He read a lot. Even tried his hand at story writing, especially wrote some like little sci-fi stories. Sci-fi was kind of his first love. And from an early age, he found a love not only of science fiction, but of comic books, and in the form of EC comics, a love of horror. In school, he showed an especially strong interest in science, particularly in biology and lepidopterology, which I'm sure you guys know what that is, but for those who don't, it's the study of moths.
Oh, okay. I thought it was the study of leopards.
That would make more sense. But that he, for some reason, that's what he gravitated towards, and that led to him pursuing science in college.
And then an interview with him, I saw, he obviously was into science, but just to put it out there, he talks about as a child being very interested in film then too, and you mentioned that, but he tells the story about he would go to a place called the Pylon, and he says it's now called the Royal, I think, but he says he definitely remembers watching a lot of films, and the films that traumatized him the most were Disney movies.
I've heard him talk about Bambi.
Yeah, he said Bambi, especially the kids being separated from their mothers. He also says the movie that made him have to sleep with the lights on was Blue Lagoon. He said that movie really stood out to him and disturbed him because, again, it was the separation of the kids from everything else. I remember it for different reasons. I remember it because of Brooke Shields.
Yes.
Naked. Yeah. But he says in his neighborhood, he grew up around a lot of immigrants, especially Italian immigrants. And one of his big memories is that he was watching like a Hopalong Cassidy movie or something. And he came out of the theater, and across the street, there was another theater called the Studio, and it only showed Italian films. And because the neighborhood he was in, they all, that it could stay in business that way. And he said he saw like a bunch of adults coming out and they were weeping. And he said it just really blew his mind. These weren't like kids crying about something like Bambi. This was like adults upset. And so he had to find out what it was. And he went across the street, and the movie that was playing was La Strada by Federico Fellini.
Yeah.
And he says he remembers that was the first time that it really hit him how powerful cinema could be. And he became pretty invested at that point in like European films as well. And like Kurosawa, he mentioned, and that kind of thing.
I imagine he, just sits horrified whenever he watches a Pixar movie.
Oh God, the beginning of Up probably destroys it.
He'll find a way to work that into
some blood and guts.
some kind of genre movie.
Well, in 1963, Cronenberg enrolled at the University of Toronto as a science major, but he dropped out within a few months because he felt that the courses lacked the excitement, discovery, creativity, the infinite possibility that you get with a study of literature and which you should get with the study of science. I think he just found it a little too rigid in a classroom setting. So he quits the science program and he enrolls as an English major. He's doing English, he's doing literature, and he finished first in his class after his first year as an English major and won a kind of prestigious university award for one of his short stories. So he's still writing at this time. He starts to get an interest in filmmaking at this time. As Gary said, he's been a film fan his whole life, basically. But it's at this point while he's in college that he gets the idea of, he starts getting interested in the making of movies as opposed to just enjoying them as an art form. And his interest in filmmaking was sparked by a film that was made by one of his classmates, a guy named David Sector. The film was called Winter Kept Us Warm, and it was the first English-Canadian film ever screened at the Cannes Film Festival. And, he'd always been a lover of film, but he considered himself a writer. He wanted to be a novelist. That was his goal going to school, for English, was that he was going to become a novelist. But this movie, Winter Kept Us Warm, opened his eyes up to the possibilities of actually creating films, of thinking that this may be something that I can do.
Yeah, he was really super into writing just because obviously he was English major, like you mentioned, and had written stuff. But his father, you mentioned, was a freelancer. He was a journalist, and he said he just, through his father, fell in love with writing. He said he would fall asleep to the sound of the typewriter. That was like a comforting sound to him. So he just imagined himself doing that for the rest of his life. It was just kind of ingrained.
Yeah. So after a couple of years, he took a break from school, traveled to Europe for almost a year. He mostly lived in Copenhagen before returning and finishing his degree in 1967. So when he returned to Toronto from Europe, he became enthralled with the city's thriving underground film scene. So inspired by the underground film scene that was going on in New York, where guys like, Andy Warhol are making these experimental films, he, along with Ian Ewing and Ivan Reitman, co-founded the Toronto Film Co-op. So before we get into like the making of his films, it should be noted, I think, that Cronenberg was never formally trained as a filmmaker. He didn't go to film school or anything. In fact, to prepare to shoot his earliest films, he actually just read a bunch of copies of American Cinematographer magazine and played around with cameras and taught himself. So he decides he's going to try to make a movie on his own. He's got a little bit of knowledge from what he's read, and he goes out and rents a 16 millimeter camera. And then with some help from his friends and his then fiance, later wife, Margaret, he shot his first short films, which were called Transfer and From the Drain.
Yeah, he gives a lot of credit to that magazine and the encyclopedia. He mentions he didn't have, in one of the interviews I was watching with him, he says, we didn't have Wikipedia back then, so there was no easy way to do this. So I'm like scouring through, looking up things like cameras, lenses, sound. He was like, a big question he remembered was like, how do you even sync sound and film? I just didn't understand how to do any of this.
I mean, how would you if...
Yeah, exactly. He talks about that at this time too. Another thing, the reason he's kicking in so late, he feels, is partly because when you're living in Toronto, movies come from LA. Canada was, it had TV. That was a big thing. But it just didn't occur to you that you could actually make a film. Movies were from some other land.
Of course, Canada's like a big filmmaking hub now because of tax credits and things like that. A lot of TV shows shoot in Vancouver. But yeah, at the time, it absolutely was not any sort of filmmaking hub.
Later, like you said, I mean, what it is now, he said he feels like was perfect. He feels like Toronto is actually the perfect place to make movies. He says it's his quote was it's halfway between Europe and Hollywood. And he said, so my filmmaking always reflects where I am and who I am. There's a commercial element mixed with an art house element.
So I do want to talk a little bit about these short films and these early films that David Cronenberg did. The first one, Transfer, is it's about 7 minutes, a little under 7 minutes, a little short film. And it tells the story of this psychiatrist. He's sitting at a table out in the snow outside. The whole thing is set outside for no discernible reason, listening to the complaints of his patient who's sort of been obsessively following him. And then From the Drain features two men sitting in a bathtub, fully clothed, sitting in a bathtub, discussing a war and what sounds like biological warfare. That they're both kind of veterans of some sort of war, some sort of conflict. And then it ends with this like plant thing coming out of the drain and strangling one of the guys. And then the other guy takes the dead man's shoes and puts them in a cabinet with a bunch of other shoes. It's very bizarre, very surreal and odd. So did you watch any of these, Gary? I know I mentioned to you that I was
didn't. I wanted to get to them, and I'm going to try to before the next one, just so I can. I'm invested in Cronenberg now, but I just never got a chance to watch any of the shorts.
Well, from the drain sounds bonkers though.
Yeah, it's very, very lo-fi though, like very low budget, very kind of amateurish in the way that it's made. And honestly, they're both a little bit pretentious in the way that they're written, I think. I mean, Cronenberg can come across as pretentious to some people, I think, but I think he learns to utilize that a little bit better. I think he learns to utilize his intellect a little bit better later on, honestly.
It's weird. He does sound like a really pretentious guy in like every interview, and he's smart as hell.
He's so goddamn smart. It's intimidating to do a series on him.
But the more you listen to him talk, he seems very nice.
Very
which
nice,
I guess
very
is a Canadian
funny,
thing.
Very self-effacing like he is. He seems like a genuinely like chill dude. He's just incredibly intelligent, but also incredibly self-aware, more so than most filmmakers are that I've read interviews of. So he benefits, or these short films at least, and him as a filmmaker benefited from an event in the summer of 1967 called Cineathon. This took place in Toronto. It's a 2-day marathon of experimental and avant-garde films, and it featured films from some very well-known established underground filmmakers, guys like Kenneth Anger and Andy Warhol had films playing at this thing. And it was at this event that Transfer premiered. Now you can imagine this is a film made by a first-time filmmaker who admittedly did not know what he was doing. And it's premiering alongside works of art by established artists. Kenneth Anger and Andy Warhol, Stan Brakhage, guys like this, they're showing movies here who are at the top of their game. And this little lo-fi, no budget short film made by a guy who didn't know what he was doing premieres there, and it didn't do well. It didn't have a great response. Toronto's The Globe and Mail, the newspaper, gave it a scathing review. It is, and here's a quote from their review. They called it a pathetic effort by Toronto's David Cronenberg, horribly acted and scarcely directed. It didn't have the decency to be original. It was stolen from a Nichols and May sketch. So yes, they accused him of plagiarism. Nichols and May was a comedy duo. Mike Nichols, who later became a well-known filmmaker, it was his like comedy duo. And yeah, they accused him for stealing the plot from that, and they misspelled his name as David Cronenberg. So kind of a double insult there. It feels
we
like
should go ahead and change the name to the new Flesh, the body horror of David Cronenberg.
Well, I was going to say that just feels like they're spelling it phonetically, right? Like that's how Canadians speak. Like, oh, it feels like a little. What that went Irish?
What was that?
Oh, wow. David Cronenberg. No,
you're still doing a leprechaun voice.
I know.
David
Well, that's
Cronenberg.
how I was trying to do a leprechaun. I was trying to do a Canadian accent. I'm not very good at this. It's just like, oh, David Cronenberg, eh?
No, that's still Irish.
Oh, David Cronenberg, eh?
I hate to bother you, but is it well, you know what? We'll just figure it out. I know how your name's spelled. It's all good.
Yeah, Todd's got the Canadian accent down.
Yeah, so you should all reviews of David Cronenberg movies from here on Todd should read in a Canadian accent.
So despite the fact that Transfer was completely trashed in the first ever review of Cronenberg's career, the festival still gave Toronto's underground film scene and Cronenberg's career a boost because nobody else was really doing this kind of stuff in Canada at the time. But he also knew that if he wanted to be considered a serious filmmaker, he couldn't keep making these short little, 16 millimeter grainy films. He received a grant, $3,500 Canadian dollars, to write a novel. And instead of writing the novel, he used it to pay for another movie. And he rented a 35 millimeter camera and started his work on his next film, which is called Stereo.
When we found out that he used the money not for writing a book but for making a movie, we were a little upset. We didn't say anything though, but he seems like a nice guy, so we let it slide.
This is going to be a great series. I'm very excited about this now.
I'll work on my Canadian accent so we can just really get it going, Todd.
So Stereo is considered by many to be Cronenberg's first feature, although it's only 63 minutes long. So I kind of considered like a featurette. Remember, we talked about those on our Battle Royale episode, those not quite feature length, but not quite short, but 63 minutes. So it's considered his first full length film. And it is a vast improvement over his previous films, at least from a technical standpoint, mostly due to it being shot on 35 millimeter. So it looks better, but also because Cronenberg's starting to learn to work around some of his limitations, budgetary limitations, that is.
For instance, listen, just because it's shorter doesn't mean it's any less. Things that are smaller can do the job as big long things. Big long American things.
Shorter.
People like shorter things sometimes. They're easy to handle.
It's very cold if we lived in warmer environments.
That's true. Listen,
I feel like I'm podcasting with Bob and Doug McKenzie.
My mother was an accomplished pianist, and she always said, listen, you don't always want a really big piano.
So in order to afford to shoot the film in 35 millimeter, he shot in black and white because it's cheaper than color film. And he shot the film silently. He couldn't afford to shoot on 35 millimeter and shoot synced sound. So he had to choose one or the other. So the only dialogue in the film is actually in the form of a voiceover. There's music in it, or kind of music. It's more like, I don't know, droning kind of stuff, but the only dialogue is in a voiceover. There's like 3 different voices doing voiceover throughout the whole hour plus film, but no actual dialogue being spoken on screen. It's because he wasn't recording any sound on set. Didn't have the ability to. That film, it's wild. It's set at a facility called the Canadian Academy of Erotic Inquiry.
Well, if you're going to have questions about something, I mean, let's inquire about some eroticism, eh?
And it follows several test subjects who are part of this parapsychological experiment where they're being endowed with telepathic abilities, which they're encouraged to develop through sexual exploration. So from a technical standpoint, the film, unlike the shorts, in my opinion, kind of shows this is the first promise of what Cronenberg will become, although it's still very much an experimental film, and it is definitely not for everyone. But Stereo embodies several of the themes that would become common in his later movies, like the exploration of new states of consciousness via sexual experimentation. This is something that we'll see it in Shivers, the movie we're talking about today, but also in Videodrome, Dead Ringers, Naked Lunch, M Butterfly, Crash. This is something that he is a big part of his career, and it's here right from the beginning. And also of note is the film star, a guy named Ronald Mlodzik. He was a friend of Cronenberg's. He was in the short films, or in one of the short films, and he wasn't really a trained actor. Cronenberg was literally just recruiting his friends to do these movies with him. But Mlodzik would end up appearing in several of Cronenberg's early films, including the one that follows this, Crimes of the Future, and also in Shivers and Rabid.
Yeah, you were talking about the feature thing. I think he really distinguishes, or just if people are wondering how we're starting, where we're starting, I mean, he kind of distinguishes Shivers as his first professional film, i.e. someone is paying me to make a movie.
And he's working with a crew and everything. So before Stereo was ever even officially released, he had already begun working on his next film, which was Crimes of the Future. And this film, it's about the same length, just over an hour long. And it was also shot without synced sound, although this time it's in full color, but it's got a lot of voiceover, just like Stereo did. And the plot of this one's a little more complex. It follows a character named Adrian Tripod as he travels through, that's his name, as he travels through a series
he wasn't working with a 35 millimeter, if you know what I mean.
So it follows this character as he travels through a series of organizations with names like the House of Skin, the Institute for Neo-Venereal Disease, the Metaphysical Import-Export, and the Oceanic Podiatry Group.
I was wondering if we were going to start talking about Justin's mother. Wait, that's very rude of me, and I apologize.
Which one of those
there's no I mean, everybody knows she is the acting general manager of the House of Skin.
Listen, you can earn a very good living there.
throughout all these organizations, he meets various groups of men who are trying to adjust to a world where most of the women have died off from some sort of plague. So it's really interesting, but it feels both of these films. I watched the shorts and both of these films this week, and Stereo and Crimes of the Future feel very similar. They feel almost like opposite sides of the same coin, but they also feel very different from the rest of his filmography. But they do share a lot of the same themes of his later work. I mentioned some of the stuff on Stereo, but he's also these institutes. They've got all these kind of almost goofy names, but institutes become a major recurring feature in most of Cronenberg's films, especially these body horror films early on. I mean, you've got in Shivers, you've got some scientists working on stuff, but in RABID, there's going to be this plastic surgery institute. Scanners has it's really interesting to watch these early films before he was even a quote unquote professional filmmaker and see some of the sort of obsessions that he will explore later on in his work. It's really kind of cool to go back and see he was doing this stuff when he was 23, 24 years old.
He hated women even then.
But I mean, it's kind of cool to watch. To see these things pop up in his artwork and then watch the progression through, through his life. And not to show my hand a little early, but like, I really dug this.
The House of Skin, right? You don't want to see where his hand's at. Okay.
I really did like this movie, but I kept thinking the whole time, was like, God, I wonder what it would look like if they remade it today. And I was like, oh, and who would be involved in everything? I was like, honestly,
Slither, James Gunn.
Yeah, there you go. But it's interesting to see like how we as a society have progressed and thought trains dealing with a lot of the stuff that's going on in these movies, and and how they're viewed in society, and then seeing how it was viewed then versus how it may be viewed today. I think that's an interesting thing to take a look at.
So a couple of things should be noted.
You know what? You're entitled to your opinion, and that's fair and valid. And I appreciate your honesty, Gary.
So a couple of things should be noted about these films. One is that Cronenberg did not work with a big group of collaborators on these. Aside from a couple of actors who appear in these films, the only real constant was like Cronenberg himself. He didn't have a big crew. He says that he made these films in isolation, essentially. He's the cameraman, the editor, the director, the writer, like he's doing it all. He's not working with other people. So that's going to be one of the biggest differences between this and Shivers. And also the films, these early films, Stereo and Crimes of the Future, are firmly rooted in science fiction, not the horror that he would later become known for, though he does some science fiction down the line. And a lot of his horror films have science fiction elements to them, certainly. But these movies still, even though they're not what I would ever consider a horror film, they still definitely have a fascination with the human body. That's a major part of the plot on both of these, even if they're not quite body horror. He's definitely got this biological fascination that'll run through his entire filmography. So these films, as most underground films are, were kind of released gradually. They play here and there. And they were met with a good bit of success. Stereo was even screened at the Museum of Modern Art and at the Film Forum in New York City. And reviews were mostly positive on these. But again, they're playing to art house crowds. They're playing to people who are into experimental films. Neither of these films would have done well in a commercial setting at all. But Cronenberg was praised as an up-and-coming talent. But after these movies came out, his career as a filmmaker kind of slowed down. So at the end of 1970, he moved to France for a year. During that time, he made a few short documentaries for Canadian television. So he's still working, making stuff, but he's not like, it's kind of for hire stuff, nothing that is really artistically doing anything for him. And he continued to make a few more of these even after he moved back to Toronto. But while he was in France, a visit to the Cannes Film Festival convinced Cronenberg that if he wanted to continue to make films for a living, if this is what he wanted to do with his life, he can't just keep making these experimental films that would only be screened in art houses and at festivals. He had to make a commercial film. He's like, if I want this to pay the bills, I've got to make a movie that makes money, basically. So a year later, he took his first step into that world. And in 1972, he was hired to direct an episode of an anthology TV series called Program X. The episode was called Secret Weapons. It's set in the future. It's about this pharmaceutical corporation, again, this big institution that meets resistance from rebellious bikers, which, oddly enough, motorcycles is another thing we're going to see pop up again and again in Cronenberg's work. And it's notable not only because, the idea of a pharmaceutical corporation clashing with bikers sounds exactly like what you would expect from a David Cronenberg movie, but also this Program X was the first thing that he filmed for commercial reasons. It's the first thing he's getting paid to film, and the first one that he's making within the confines of traditional production structures.
It's kind of interesting though, like even out, before he gets into actual commercial stuff or making any money with it, he's already, as he put it, he's like, I had international filmmaking experience before I ever made anything professionally.
Yeah, that's true. And Cronenberg wasn't the only art house director to consider going commercial at this time. A lot of his peers knew that they could kind of disguise the more transgressive content of their films if they put it into genre films. So you've got someone like Kenneth Anger, an experimental filmmaker. He makes My Demon Brother. Harry Kumel made Daughters of Darkness. Paul Morrissey, who was one of Andy Warhol's collaborators, he makes Flesh for Frankenstein and Blood for Dracula. So they're all making these horror movies, but they're putting the same kind of transgressive ideas that they would put into their experimental films, but they're dressing them up in commercial clothing, if that makes sense. But Cronenberg wasn't actually specifically trying to make a horror film for his first commercial feature. The way he explains it, when he starts working on the script, he just started writing the story. He knew what the story was. He starts writing it, and the subject matter alone just kind of steered it into a horror film. Like there was no way that subject matter was going to go in any other direction than as a horror film.
Yeah, he says he never set out for sci-fi either. He just didn't really know what he was doing when he put pen to paper. I think he was really into sci-fi novels at this time. He says Stereo and Crimes of the Future have sci-fi elements as well, but he was also really focused in at that time on fantasy and the dreamlike element of things. With horror, like he says, fear or anxiety never really entered into his thought process when he started out. He'd just been interested in science, that he'd see all this stuff about other worlds and stuff like that. But it is interest in science that we mentioned earlier. He had been really interested in moths, like you mentioned. He'd always had a fascination with insects and that kind of thing. And that you didn't have to travel to other worlds to find aliens or strange creatures. We have them right here on Earth. So he says this movie really was a science experiment for him.
Yeah, I mean, even his sci-fi stuff, none of it's like space stuff, which is why Total Recall would have actually been a kind of a weird swerve for him later down the line if he had done it. Because even his stuff that is sci-fi is all firmly rooted in like real science, or at least appears to be real science. He treats it like real science.
Yeah, and when he talks about it too, he talks about like that he kind of felt on Mars when he even started making his first like professional film, because as it starts to drift into this horror element, he said at this time to still remember that it was, if people think of horror, they're thinking of movies that featured castles, capes.
Right. This was kind of like during the same time that stuff like, Rosemary's Baby had come out a few years earlier. Some of the stuff from Wes Craven, Last House on the Left, things like that would move horror into kind of this new horror realm of the 70s and 80s. It was just starting to kind of take off at this time. Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out a year before this, which was kind of like the bomb that went off that turned horror on its head.
Yeah, he says that like we're going to talk about Cinepix here in a second. He just calls it a minor miracle because they were the only people. He said it was the Roger Corman / New World Picks of Canada. Yeah, he knew that had to be the place to start, or who he would even pitch this idea to, because for even what he wanted to do, he talks about like Roger Corman again. Roger Corman, there's that name again. He always comes up, but he says that's the guy who gave the start to Coppola, Scorsese, like all these guys. So he's like, he had the right idea, and this is the closest thing we have to that.
Yeah, so that's essentially what happened. He completes the script, he starts shopping it around, and the script gains the attention of Cinepix. So Cinepix is this Montreal-based production company. They'd had some success in mostly softcore porn films, a lot of them being exported to Europe. And they had seen the market for these types of films slowing down, and they had a hard time selling them in America at all. So they were interested in getting into more commercial business, film business, specifically in distributing like horror and exploitation films. So that's kind of what they were looking for when they came across David Cronenberg's script for Shivers. And they loved the script, but they were not sure that Cronenberg should be the director. They had seen his earlier films, those experimental films, and they weren't sure that the guy who was directing Stereo and Crimes of the Future should be the guy to direct a commercial horror film. Because, like I said, they are far from commercial films. So they just didn't really know they liked the script. They're like, I don't know, maybe we should shop around and find another director for this.
And who the fuck is he?
You know? And who the fuck is he? He's nobody. Yeah, he's not a name.
David Cronenberg is.
Right. In fact, at one point, leading up to the making of the film, Cronenberg took a trip to Los Angeles. He went to meet Barbara Steele, who he wanted to cast. And Cronenberg and a friend of his named Norman Snyder, who this guy had written that Program X episode that he directed. And I think he writes Dead Ringers down the line for Cronenberg.
He does. Yeah, he goes on and co-writes Dead Ringers.
So they were introduced to Jonathan Demme, the director, who had just directed Barbara Steele in a movie called Caged Heat. And they're having this conversation with Jonathan Demme, and Demme revealed to Cronenberg that Cinepix had actually reached out to him and sent him the script for Shivers, hoping that he would sign on as the director. So they were actively like trying to hire other directors behind Cronenberg's back, which, understandably pissed him off.
And he's already frustrated at this time because for Cronenberg, the consensus had been with like most people you talk to when you're trying to get into movie making is that you got to go to Hollywood. And he was resisting this because he felt that when you go to Hollywood, the pressure, it's a lot of pressure all the time, not only to do things, but then there's the B, which is to make Hollywood films. It becomes even harder as a Canadian because they want Hollywood films. They want this specific feel. And if you haven't grown up around that or been around it, he's obviously seen that stuff, but he's got his own thing and he feels like it's going to be impossible for him to survive in Hollywood, or that's really where he wants to be. He gives examples when he talks about, and these are names one of them we'll talk about in just a minute, but like Ivan Reitman, or he mentions Lorne Michaels, or people he knew that ended up going to LA. And then Lorne, of course, goes to New York and does Saturday Night Live. And Ivan Reitman we'll talk about. But he says, but he feels like you can look at their work now and they essentially became American. They were, it's reflected in their work. They totally just changed and their vision and their voice and that sort of thing. Not that he hated Hollywood, but there was just other things he wanted to do besides just Hollywood movies. And he thought if it was ever going to happen, that he might get sucked into Hollywood anyway. If he wants to make movies, he had filmmakers he knew from Canada. He mentions, I think, Norman Jewison and such that ended up having to go to Hollywood to end up getting their movies made. Of course, they were successful, but whatever. But what you were just talking about, he said him and his buddy, they end up renting a Mustang convertible and driving down there because things are not moving with Cinepix. And he got to meet all of these people he knew, like Roger Corman. He said he met Roger Corman on that trip. He said guys like Corman would tell him constantly, like, oh, we love Shivers. Yeah, Shivers sounds cool. Like everybody who hadn't read it that he talked to, So it even further nailed that in, like, I'm gonna have to come here because these guys all get it. And and then there's the situation, like you mentioned, of directing. They wanted to include him in other ways besides directing, but they just didn't trust him as a director. And then, like you said, Jonathan Demme, if people don't know, I think that's that. Didn't he do Silence of the Lambs? Silence of the Lambs. So he had just directed Barbara Steele in Women in Chains. And that's where, so they were hanging out on the beach, and he said that happened, that like, he was like, oh yeah, I read it. He's like, well, how the hell did you read it? And he's like, oh, somebody sent it to me to direct it. And he was just like, man, that's what?
Fucked up.
You know what? At the end of the day, what Cinepix was doing was just, it wasn't very kind. It wasn't very nice. I didn't really appreciate it. And I thought, you know what? How dare you? This is infuriating. And no one does this to David Cronenberg.
Demi said, yeah, I had a feeling there was something weird about this. Like they weren't telling me or whatever. Just a quick bit about Cinepix for those that don't know. Is this company founded by two guys, John Dunning and Andre Link. I went down a rabbit hole with them. And since they're,
I did too.
since they're important to the process, but they were partners and together for forever, battling church and government to like make movies and essentially these low budget kind of movies. John Dunning started out as like a documentarian or something. He'd done some like a big thing for the University of Montreal where he learned like editing and camera work. I forget, it was like Niagara Film or something. They went into bankruptcy and so he got into TV or something. But he said he would get to work with them and go to screenings. And so he said he went to this one that they said the censorship bureau in Canada was run by Jesuits, like in all these priests. They would go and watch screenings. He said he got invited to one. He sat in the back row and was watching this one film. And in the middle of it, this woman takes off her clothes and he's watching. And he says all of a sudden he can't see the screen very well and he can't figure out what's going on. It's like blurry or something. And he said he literally starts to realize that what's happening is all these guys, these old men that are on this board that are sitting in front of him, they all have big bald heads. And he said the lights are like beating down and they're getting perspiration on their heads. And like it's steaming up. He says these guys are freaking the fuck out about this naked lady on TV or on the screen. Funny. And he's like, this has got to stop. And so that pioneered his idea for like breaking up censorship and being against it. And so he started meeting up with other free thinkers and stuff. And him and Andre would like work with people to like get, essentially, long story short, more and more titty into each movie that they did. Basically, like they would get like a little. They would push it. He was like, it was a long process, but like you'd slip a little bit more, and they'd be like, fine and fine. All right. Well,
until eventually they're making softcore porn.
Exactly. So, and then what happened with the porn was they said that the big thing they had running for them is, they're running out of. They don't have much money themselves, so what you have to do is you have to find like a series that really works. Like you have to a big one they did was like the Snake Eater series with Lorenzo Lamas. And they said once you find like
a series of films.
Yeah, like a series of films. Like he said when he was growing up, he was really into like something the Bobbsey twins, I think is the example he gives. But it's like you find something that hits and then you just like keep making that because you've got a built-in audience that's going to keep coming back to it. So they would do that with like almost like it made me think of when he was describing it. This is Dunning as like the Emmanuel series or something like it'd be like that. You find something that really works. And if it's like, or they can connect you to this softcore porn series or something like that, then you keep making those because there is a small niche audience for this, but it'll work and it keeps you in business. And the problem comes when somebody breaks out, like he mentions, like Lorenzo Lamas or David Cronenberg, who
Lorenzo Lamas was a breakout.
Yeah, it was a breakout for them
because of Renegade or what?
I guess. But
don't knock Renegade. That's a dope show, man.
Well, the problem they have here is they can't turn the money around fast enough because they don't have financial backing on their own. They don't have enough money, so they have to wait for the money to actually come in, and then they can pay out better and make the next one and that sort of thing. So eventually if somebody outgrows them, they move on, so you don't get to, it's hard to like build a studio, but they ended up, they make Shivers. They end up making RABID, which we'll talk about, and Ilsa film.
Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, which is another series.
Yeah.
But yeah, they ended up making like a lot of they made exploitation films. Meatballs was Ivan Reitman. But yeah,
John Dunning, though, just to put it out there, would be kind of fun for his own series, honestly. He was like big into women being stars, which you'll see in some of these movies.
If you've never seen Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS and you're into like exploitation movies of this era, I highly recommend it. The whole series is pretty wild, but especially that first one is really good.
He's dead now, unfortunately. He died in like 2011.
John Dunning.
Yeah, John Dunning. But his son said he was working on the sequel to My Bloody Valentine, the 3D.
Yeah,
That was what he was worried on during cancer. Like he was.
Oh yeah, I saw that interview. I think it's on the Shivers Blu-ray.
Yeah, and that's sad. He said he was
Yeah.
bummed because he had all these great kills planned, and I'm bummed that I don't get to see it now because he said he was disappointed with the first one there, the first remake.
The remake. Yeah.
Yeah, because all the kills were done with the pickaxe, and
Yeah,
so he was
no
like, "Oh,
variety."
man." He's like, I don't have any of the same kill in this one. He was like super excited about it before he passed.
Well, I always get curious about these companies like Cinepix who like aren't around anymore, and you wonder what happened to them. And what happened to Cinepix was in the late 90s, they were purchased and their name was changed to Lionsgate Films.
Oh, I did not know that.
So yeah, the company that produced Ilsa She-Wolf of the SS and Shivers and Rabid also made The Hunger Games and Twilight.
Nice.
And Saw and John Wick and a lot of other cool shit.
I would love to see
Nice.
David Cronenberg's Twilight.
You know what? It would probably be pretty good.
That'd be awesome.
So David Cronenberg comes back from LA, pissed off. He goes back to the producers at Cinepix, which are the guys that Gary was just talking about, John Dunning and Andre Link. And he wants to confront them about it. But by the time he gets back, they'd already decided, hey, we're going to greenlight the project. And okay, David, you can direct it. So this isn't a quick process, by the way. I went over all this like it was a matter of months, but this is a matter of several years, during which time, over the course of those years, Cinepix is debating on who should direct. And they're spending that time trying to get funding from the Canadian Film Development Corporation, who had been a little bit reluctant to fund the project at first. And the reason is that the CFDC they're pretty new. They were formed in the late 60s. So basically the Canadian film industry at this time, they had become known for putting out these like award-winning documentaries, but the fiction film industry in Canada had pretty much collapsed in like the 1930s. So by the late 60s, the government, they're trying to figure out a way that they can kind of stimulate non-documentary film production in Canada. So they founded the CFDC, and David Cronenberg's previous film, Crimes of the Future, was actually one of the first films to receive CFDC funding at all.
Because Canada is like, I think Europe is this way too. It's a situation that's totally different than America as far as like filmmaking goes. And I think when I started to ramble about Cinepix, this is kind of where I was trying to get to, was that, you know, these guys relied on the government to fund the movie. That's how these companies get it made. And then they can try to make their own money once they're paying back the loan they're essentially getting from the government.
Right.
And it has to go through that way. There's like not an option of like, you know, like private production companies, really not in the same way that America,
at least not at
works.
this time.
Yeah, exactly. And Cinepix had been doing well in Canada and Europe, but you mentioned earlier they hadn't gotten into the USA. So again, Corman, that name, I mean, he was the blueprint for like what could work. So like horror showed up on their radar during this time too, because of what he was able to do. It was a unique idea that they could, you know, you make these low budget horror movies and they work really, really well. And seems like making a lot of money. And, you know, then you just keep doing that over and over again now. And hopefully you can get somewhere with it. So they were set with David Cronenberg. They knew, I think David Cronenberg said nobody knew more than Andre and Dunning how little I knew about filmmaking. So I know he said John Dunning like took David Cronenberg and set him up at his cottage and was like, you're going to stay here. And every morning you're getting up and you go down to the boathouse and you write in the boathouse and work out things. And I'll call you at lunch and we'll talk, because the boathouse didn't have a phone. So it was to be like, you're locked in here and focus only on this. Yeah. And then come back and you'll call me at lunch and then we'll talk and we'll get it going. But they babysat it basically.
Yeah. I mean, he basically, Cronenberg says that John Dunning and Andre Link were his film school. That's what he says, because he admittedly had no idea how to make a movie, especially under these conditions. Because again, his other films, he had done everything himself and taught himself. He had never worked with a crew or on a professional set or anything like that. So they basically were teaching him how to make a movie while they were making a movie. They were very seasoned. They'd been doing this for a long time. So they didn't want to take any chances with this first-time director on this movie. So they surrounded him, once they went to shoot, they surrounded him with other crew members who were more experienced so that Cronenberg could essentially learn how to make the movie from the people around him.
He says his first production meeting, he gets in there, he's at the head of the table, and this, I think, is where it really set in for him. He said he's just sitting there, and he didn't know who anybody was or what they do, or even once he knows a job title, like what that means.
What it actually is, yeah.
Yeah. And he's like, and now I've got all these people sitting around a table waiting for me to tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And,
I don't even know what their job description is.
Yeah, we've got 15 days of shooting plus like maybe 2 pickup days on the schedule. And he said, if it wasn't for John and Andre during that time being wonderful mentors and surrounding me with people who knew what they were doing, I'd have been fucked, basically.
Right. And one of the first people that they did appoint was an old friend of Cronenberg's from his days in the Toronto underground film scene. We've mentioned him a couple of times on here, but that was Ivan Reitman. I'm sure most of our listeners recognize the name Ivan Reitman. If you're listening to the show, then you're a movie fan. And if you're a movie fan, then you know the name Ivan Reitman. We've talked about him on the show here before. We talked about it back on our heavy metal episode because he was one of the producers on that, helped that movie get made. But in the decades after Shivers, he'd go on to direct movies like Meatballs, Stripes, and, of course, Ghostbusters.
Yeah.
But he got to start working on some lower budget genre films. At the time that Shivers was being made, he had already directed his first couple of films, Foxy Lady and Cannibal Girls, which are these 2 low budget comedies. They also happen to be the first screen credits of Eugene Levy.
I like that guy.
I love Eugene Levy.
Yeah.
But he also ended up doing the film's music, or not. He wasn't a composer. He was the music supervisor on Shivers because this is all library music. There's no original score for this because they didn't have the money to do an original score.
Yeah, he was brought in as the line producer, and then like you said, music supervisor. I think Cronenberg said we couldn't afford to have like a traditional score, so it was all needle drop that Reitman set out, and he acquired it all. And
he does the same thing on RABID. I don't think Cronenberg had a real score until like his third film.
Yeah, it said it was. I think I read it wasn't until 79 and the Brood that he was able to hire a composer, Howard Shore, which would
I think he still works with.
Yeah, I think he's collaborated with him like 15 times or something.
Yeah. So Reitman brings in his Cannibal Girls co-writer Daniel Goldman and the director of photography from that film, a guy named Robert Sad. And the film's special effects were by this guy named Joe Blasco, who got his start on like The Gong Show and Carol Burnett and like all these like TV sketch shows, not doing like creature work. So I'm not entirely sure how he got the film, but he's a fun guy to listen to talk about the effects. But it's like, if you look at his filmography prior to Shivers, he's not doing like monsters or anything. He's just doing makeup.
Well, he's in Canada. And so like, there's not like a Canadian.
He's
industry.
not Canadian though.
Okay. Well,
yeah, he's not Canadian. He's American.
Okay. Well, I didn't even know that, but something I was reading was talking about there wasn't like a Canadian industry or that field yet. There had not been a horror film, really, like a serious horror film in Canada yet. So yeah, I don't know then. I don't know how this guy ended up. I just assumed he lived around there or something.
Yeah, I think he's American. And there's a makeup company now called Joe Blasco Cosmetics that I think is I assume that's his.
Yeah. I think Cronenberg in some interview mentioned he had a school right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with a crew assembled, Shivers goes before cameras on a budget of only $180,000 and with a shooting schedule of only 15 days under the title of Orgy of the Blood Parasites, which is fucking great.
Yeah, that's pretty
great
dope.
name. But it's a great name. But Cronenberg and Cinepix decided that it sounded a little too much like monster movies from the 50s, and they thought it might convey the wrong thing as to what type of movie this was.
Yeah, I was looking at that.
That's what I kind of like about it.
It does. I mean, when you throw in orgy, it just, it gives it an extra little pizzazz. But,
well, plus they're not blood parasites.
Well, there's that. But yeah, he said that Kafer with it, he found clunky. He said he didn't like Shivers either, actually, in something I was reading. But
Well, I don't think he's very good at making titles for his movies.
he said with Shivers, like he never really liked it, but he couldn't think of anything else. So,
So cast in the lead role of Roger St. Luke, that's the doctor, was Paul Hampton. Paul Hampton had appeared in some low budget and exploitation movies like Women of the Prehistoric Planet and Private Duty Nurses.
Not duty nurses.
Sound like I said duty nurses.
Yeah. Private duty nurses.
There's a market for that.
Hey, you know what?
Listen, here in Canada, we don't discriminate against.
We don't kink shame here in Canada.
Yeah, whatever. No, not at all. Not
Justin
at all.
coming in with the impressions.
As long as you're not hurting anybody. If you're into duty, that's fine.
Everybody duties,
So a veteran television actor by the name of Joe Silver, not Joel Silver, Joe Silver.
I kept hearing that name. I was very disappointed to find out.
Yeah, no, it's not the same guy. Joe Silver, great voice on that guy, by the way. He plays Rollo Linsky, the Hobbs's colleague or whatever. I love this guy in this. There's something about him. I think it's that voice of his that he's just got a great presence. He's very charismatic to me. And then
not to be confused with Rollo Tony Browntown. Remember that guy? That's from Tim and Eric's Awesome Show. Great job.
Yeah.
They have to write the
jingle.
Rollo's commercial jingle. Yeah. Rollo Tony Browntown. Give me some more. Give me some more. Give me some of them Rollos.
Oh man, that's gonna be in my head all day now.
It's it's good. He's probably the star of Private Duty Nurses.
Joe Silver also, by the way, I think listeners of our show will be interested in this. One of his last credits was he did the voice of the Creep in Creep Show 2.
Oh,
yeah,
how about that?
Then also in the cast, you've got Ronald Mlodzik. We mentioned him before. He had been in the short films. He appears here as Merrick. He's the superintendent or the manager of the apartment building that we see.
He's got a unique face.
Yeah, he does. It's an interesting guy. He's got an interesting presence even in those short films.
Cronenberg said it was his pleasure to get him into a movie where he could actually be paid.
Yeah, he actually got money for it.
Yeah, because he had been in Stereo and Crimes of the Future.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just him paying a favor back.
Sure.
Cronenberg had never cast either. That was a whole other thing for him too. He had never done this. So like John and Andre and Ivan, he said, had to hold his hand.
He'd only worked with his friends before.
Yeah. So they issued like an open casting call for anybody off the street. And he said he was like, just find whoever you can find. It was like,
which is not normally what you do, but for this movie, they got for some of those like smaller roles, especially, they got some really like interesting looking little character actors, like the laundry lady or, some of the other neighbors. I think they've got great looks that you just would not find in like a Hollywood casting call.
That's a good point. Yeah. He said they had like a little bit of money for like the top of the bill, but otherwise you were part of the process was teaching people how to act. Like people didn't know how to emote or anything. And he was like, which sucked because you didn't have time for that shit. So
with 15 days to shoot.
Right.
So for the female roles, for the lead female roles, he cast Susan Petrie as Janine. Petrie had kind of become a minor celebrity in Canada after appearing in. She was sort of the object of desire, the hot girl in these Quebec sex farces. There's one called Loving and Laughing that was really popular, and one called Rip Off. These are both from like the early 70s. And she, played a very different type of role than she plays here. But she was somewhat well known in Canada at the time. So getting her on the cast was kind of a big deal. And then Lynn Lowry, who plays Nurse Forsyth, she had previously appeared in George Romero's The Crazies and in a couple of early Trauma films.
Yeah, he said
so she kind of had a genre credit too.
Yeah, you mentioned her haunting eyes and strange screen presence.
Yeah, she really does have an incredible screen presence. It's like really unique, I think.
She's
like that moment at the end of the film where she comes up out of the swimming pool and like looks right at the camera.
Oh yes.
It's a great visual. It really
very
is.
striking. Very striking.
I've looked at that multiple times. I mean, yeah, it was great acting.
And then of course, one of the queens of horror herself, Barbara Steele, was cast as Janine's neighbor Betts. Barbara Steele, of course, is famous. She did a lot of Italian stuff. She's probably most well known for her role in Mario Bava's Black Sunday or in Roger Corman's The Pit and the Pendulum. And she's also in Fellini's 8½, among others. But she is like a legend in the horror genre.
Lynn Lowry lives in Atlanta. We need to look her up. Yeah, I was just looking. I actually, you were talking about this, and just to lay it out there on the table, I Googled her name and just did a little image search real quick so I could see it one more time. And but then her Twitter came up, and she has a Twitter. And 2 hours ago, she wrote, "Hi everyone, I'm selling my mom's 2007 Mercury Grand Prix. Excellent condition. I live near Atlanta, so if you're interested or know anyone who might be, send me a message. Hope you're all having a wonderful weekend."
Nice. This was kind of weird for me because as I was watching, I found myself like recasting the movie based on like who kind of looked like, you know, more modern actors, you know, currently working actors. I found just as an example, like the guy that plays Nicholas Tudor, I kept seeing Adam Driver.
Man, I did too. When I was watching this, I was like, that guy looks like somebody tried to draw Adam Driver from memory.
Yes. And his wife, Jane, and I kept seeing she was Mary Jane in the Spider-Man movies.
Kirsten Dunst.
Yeah.
I don't see that at all, but okay.
Watch it again. She's giving off some Kirsten Dunst.
Wait, who's Kirsten Dunst?
Mary Jane in the Spider-Man movies.
I mean,
we know who
Kirsten Dunst is. Like, who are you saying?
She's Nicholas Tudor's wife, Jane and Tudor.
Okay.
She's the one who's
Susan Petrie, though, is very attractive. I think. She does not own a bra, if this movie is to be believed.
Yeah. Listen, we only had $180,000 to work with. We couldn't just be handing out bras to everybody.
The nipples on screen just poking through the shirt. It's like you're watching Friends. You ever notice that on Friends? Like Monica and Rachel they're just nipping all the time. Like,
we kept it very cold. Listen, it's Canada. It's very cold up here. So the turkeys were done like on a regular basis.
So Todd, while we're talking about the cast, first of all, you get one mention of David Cronenberg.
Well, I was actually going to talk about that. I was like, you know, honestly, because he is currently part of the reoccurring cast of Star Trek Discovery, rather than me mentioning him on every episode, I'll mention him here at the top, and then give him a chance to maybe let him expand his character a little bit. And we'll see by the end of this series if anything more has happened with his character on Star Trek Discovery. But yes, to date, Mr. David Cronenberg has been in 6 episodes of Star Trek Discovery as Dr. Kovich. And I got to think Kovich, Kovich.
Oh, he's like Russian.
Something like that. He comes across, I got to imagine that they're like, just read the lines, because he comes across as friendly, but a little standoffish.
Oh, so he's playing David Cronenberg.
And he comes across as incredibly intelligent. So
So he's just playing himself. Yeah.
yeah. But 6 episodes so far, and he's been great in all of them. The only other person from this cast and crew is Mr. Thomas Sawyer, as he was one of the electricians there on the crew. Later in 1984, he was Dolly Grip in Star Trek III: The Search for Spock. Interesting thing about Mr. Sawyer, about Tom Sawyer, was that he actually got in a little trouble for saying the N-word too much, like a lot.
I mean, once is too much. Let's be honest.
Once is too much, but it was just kind of like, you know, it happens once and you think, did they just? And then it happens again and again and again and again, and you're like, oh, okay, we gotta say something. I mean, this is
can't do that.
No. So that's who I'm trekking with, and that's everybody in Star Trek.
So the guy who played Nicholas, he went by the name of Alan Mijikovsky, I think it was at the time, but he later like changed his name to Alan Coleman, which, you know, is way easier to say. So I understand that. But man, he's had a long career, usually playing like little small roles, but he's been in some like really big movies. I mean, he's still working now. He's got like 90 credits to his name. Well, granted, I say he's working now. I think his last credit was in 2012. But I mean, he's in like Seven. He's in Air Force One, but he plays like soldier number one or whatever. But hey, you know what? It's a job, and he worked on movies for 40 years or whatever till he, presumably retired.
Todd, you're not aware, and anybody who's not a part of our Discord, you should check out. I think it's in our pinned post, or maybe it's not, but it should be. You just hit us up. We have a Discord, and there's conversations that go on there. And one of the conversations Todd didn't participate in is there was a whole thing in our episode discussion about who am I trekking with, and Kurt Cake 5K said who am I trekking with should be called the Trek List. Let's argue about it. That's how he started. It should be called Trek List. Let's argue about it. Then we got a suggestion of Trekking with the Stars.
I think Justin Vance recommended that one, which I like. Trekking with the Stars. That's fun.
Andrew C said Todd's Trek Connections, or perhaps intercontractions.
That was too hard to say, Andrew.
Listen, considering most of, there's a good chance that not all of us are doing this sober. Yeah, that one's going to be a little tricky.
Yeah. So anyway, there was a whole discussion about the other names that this segment could be called.
Yeah.
If we want to do an official poll with those options and see what the fans say, I'm happy to
Maybe we'll
oblige.
do that. Maybe we'll throw that up on Twitter.
Yeah, I'll get to that. I'm still scrolling through Little Lowry's Twitter.
So while Gary's doing that, I'll continue with the story of how Shivers got made. Yeah. So that tight 15-day schedule, as you can imagine, made for a pretty intense shoot, because this is all done on location. It's at a place called Nuns Island. So the apartment in the film is set on this like kind of island that's isolated from Montreal's mainland. That's actually the kind of location they were shooting on, Nuns Island, just outside of Montreal. And it made for a kind of claustrophobic experience. There are these long corridors, windowless rooms, which, the finished product probably benefited from, because it does make for a claustrophobic feel as you're watching the movie. And Joe Blasco's effects, they were largely improvised on set. They're not the best effects. They haven't aged particularly well, but I think for the way that they're used here, I think they work. One story about the shoot, actually, there's a story that Cronenberg stayed overnight in the room where the rubber creatures were being prepared, and the fumes caused him to nearly asphyxiate as he slept.
Oh, wow.
Cronenberg almost died on this movie because of that.
Louise.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And then the environment, just staying in this location, got on the nerves of a lot of the extras who were not, professional actors, a lot of them. And Cronenberg says that probably influenced their on-screen rage. It probably made those scenes better, where they had to act like they were crazy and angry. He said that there's a quote from Cronenberg: "We all wanted to rip that place apart and run naked, screaming through the halls." And he actually tells stories that that's essentially what they did. They were all high and would like streak through the hallways because they didn't have anywhere else to go. They're isolated on this island. They can't leave, really, because they're on such a tight schedule that everyone just has to kind of be there in the morning. And they all kind of went a little crazy during the filming of this.
When you talk about that gas stuff, he tells a story about Joe Silver. He almost died in the hallway because when there's the scene, or like parasites get all over his face, and then he gets squirted in the face with this stuff that's supposed to make him steam, but the cap popped off, and then all the stuff just like splurged out onto his face. He just starts puking all over the hallway.
Whoa.
And so he says he's like on this walkie to like Ivan Reitman, and it's like, "Hey, Ivan, Joe Silver's vomiting everywhere." Nope, not part of the scene. He said, but he was like really professional. He just like vomited until he couldn't vomit anymore, and then he wiped off and went back to work.
Wow. Well, I mean, I was thinking about that first scene where the doctor ends up, cutting open the girl, and them using sort of that forced perspective for them to do most of that shot. And
a great sound effect.
Yes. And it was all like really cool. It was really well done. I was just kind of like, this is,
really working within their limitations.
But like, yeah. But it doesn't skip, it still has that very eerie feeling, especially like everything that happens prior to that. Man, it was really well done.
Justin talking about that, David Cronenberg was passing out. He was they didn't have they didn't have like this was a build. I mean, they couldn't build sets.
Yeah, they were in an apartment building.
Yeah,
and
so
even the furnishings are mostly just what was already in the apartment.
Yeah, they were like paying people to let them stay in the apartments, and so like people were actually even sleeping in the apartments and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so the room he was in was the special effects room, and so he said like his shoes would like slide off because they were like sticking to the floors from like all the blood they had in the room and stuff. And then that he was in there just like breathing God knows what the whole time. But he said that Blaska's, effects like were pretty groundbreaking at the time, like considering how cheap they were. But he had the ideas for like bladders or like, the condoms filled up to like release and like pulsate under the skin and that sort of thing, which would end up being what The Exorcist would use.
Well,
and, not because of this, but it was happening
similar
around the same time. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the slugs or the little parasites themselves, they were essentially just like these rubber sculptures, for lack of a better term, on strings. They were on like black strings, and the strings were attached to them, and they could pull them apart or push them together to make them look like they were inching along. That's how they get them to like go up the lady's like walking cane, the older lady that gets it. And you can, if you look for it, especially if you're watching this on like Blu-ray, you can see the string if you really look hard for it, but you really do have to be looking for it to see it, because they're pretty good for the budget they were working on. And the effect where it's pulsing under his skin, where you see his stomach kind of bubbling up, like that looks really good for a movie that costs less than $200,000.
Yeah.
And tell me that Dan O'Bannon didn't get an idea for that when he made Alien.
Well, so I was gonna mention that that's a whole thing. The Dan O'Bannon connection, but
I mean, Cronenberg says that he knows that Dan O'Bannon was a fan of Shivers, and this came out 4 years before Alien.
Yeah, he was having like a non-relationship with Dan O'Bannon. Like he knew a lot of people that worked with him, but he knew John Landis. Cronenberg did, and he said that John Landis told him that Dan knew very well what he would call the Canadian films. Shivers and Rabid were a big part of that when he wrote Alien.
Oh, I bet.
In Cronenberg's mind, that meant he probably took a lot of this stuff from Shivers, and he would have probably been familiar with Rabid. He also knew Ron Shusett.
The writer on Alien.
And then I think they did Total Recall too, right?
Yep.
And he said Shusett told him. Well, he said Shusett told him that he never mentioned, or he said he never seen those movies, and he believed him. But then John Landis swore that Dan talked to him about them all the time and knew them very well.
He didn't see. There's no way he didn't pull that from this movie. Also, like the name of the apartment is like the Starliner, which sounds like a fucking spaceship. Right?
Yeah.
I kept thinking that the whole time.
It sounds like the name of a spaceship.
Which, by the way, is now. It's like the name of Boeing's space passenger travel thingy they're making. Yeah, it's called the Starliner.
Yikes.
But yeah, I found a quote with him. He said, like, I have to say that some of my images, like the Parasite, ended up in things like Alien, which was more popular than any of the films I've ever made. But the writer of Alien has definitely seen those movies, Dan O'Bannon. The idea of parasites that burst out of your body and use a fluid that leaps on your face, that's all in Shivers. Yeah. Even there was even a Collider interview pretty recently where he said that he felt like it totally ripped off things from Shivers.
I mean, it does. It does. So one of the other most kind of well-known behind-the-scenes stories on this film involves a scene where Susan Petrie, she needs to cry, and she comes up to David Cronenberg. She's like, I can't cry on command. I can't do it. So when it came time to film the scene, Cronenberg, first he tried using onions. He would cut onions, make her eyes water, and that worked. And they filmed the scene, and it was out of focus. So they had to do it again, but they're out of onions. So they had one onion. So they're done with that idea. So they kind of come to an agreement that right before the scene is to be filmed, Cronenberg's going to slap her on the face and make her cry. basically. This is her. She's requesting this.
Yeah.
She's telling him, this is the only way you're going to get me to cry on screen. I need you to slap me. So he did. He slapped her like multiple times until her face went numb, and they filmed the scene.
He said he bruised his hand and she had a bruise forming on her face because
and I think it's the scene where she comes in and sees Nicholas, and it's right before like the stuff bursts out of his stomach, where she comes into his room and she's, she is pouring tears.
Yeah.
She had been like in a lot of comedy stuff or like other stuff. She wasn't like really like a trained like dramatic actor. She was doing this film for the amount she was doing this film because she wanted to get into something different. She wanted to practice her range, but yeah, she wasn't super familiar with it. And yeah, they worked out that agreement. He'd hit her and he was like smacking her around. And like he said, that even the first time he did it, the crew didn't know, and they were waiting outside the door.
Yeah.
And so like he's smacking her, and then she's like, no, harder. And so he smacks her again. She's like, harder. And he like smacks the shit out of her and then goes busting through the door, tries to. And then the crew is like waiting outside the door, just like, what the fuck is going on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so they had to reshoot the scene, which of course leads into.
Barbara Steele sees it.
Yeah.
So Barbara Steele didn't know about their arrangement either. And she sees Cronenberg slapping her fellow actress, and she gets pissed off, and she confronts him. And
she says she finishes the scene though. Like she finishes the scene like a true professional.
Yeah. But then she confronts him, and she's like holding him off the ground by the shirt. Barbara Steele, who's a very intimidating looking woman. Like she's beautiful, but she's intimidating looking. And she's like threatening to punch him in the face. And they had to explain to her that this was an arrangement that they had made together.
Yeah.
Insane. But yeah, it doesn't really help his for those who think he's a woman hater.
Yeah.
Really
I definitely don't think he's a woman hater, but
no, I don't think that too. I think he seems like a really good dude. But I felt bad for him too, like hearing him tell the story about that he was full of despair, like the first little bit, like when they had to watch they call them the what are they, the rushes?
The rushes,
which are like basically the dailies, but you get them every few days or something. He said like the first time they came back, like the eye line was awkward and the heads were all wrong and dialogue felt like it was lost. He's like freaking the fuck out,
like he's fucking it up.
Like he's fucking it up. But a lot of it was like he didn't know how to work the stuff he was looking at or dealing with, or wasn't really sure how to put it all together. But he learned on the set. He said he went from despair to euphoria by the end of the shoot. This movie was essentially his film school. Yeah.
Wow.
Shivers was released in Canada on October 10th, 1975, under the title The Parasite Murders. AIP, which is the company that's Richard Zanuck's company. They handled the American distribution. They gave it the title They Came From Within, which, as Gary mentioned before, Cronenberg felt was a little clunky, and it is. It also doesn't really make a lot of sense. But
also sounds like one of our old Skinaflicks.
And then in French-speaking Canada and in France, it was released as Frissons, which was a successful enough title that it was translated back into Shivers. Frissons in French means like the willies, like shivers. You got the willies, you got the frissons. So they called it Shivers, which ended up, of course, becoming the international title. Later adapted around the world, it is mostly what the film is known as today.
Nice.
But when it was being released, releasing it was kind of a tough nut to crack, especially in the U.S. AIP, they were putting it in the B movie market, which was kind of their bread and butter at AIP. But the film was a little too edgy for the audience that frequented B movies at the time. So it wasn't necessarily connecting with those audiences. But Cinepix, for European release, they initially showed the film at the Cannes Film Festival. It's May 1975, and it received really good reviews there, and critics liked it and buyers liked it. And a lot of European buyers ended up picking up the film for international distribution. But when it was released in Canada that fall, that's when the film was really met with some considerable controversy. So about a month before the movie was to come out, it became almost instantly notorious thanks to a single review by a guy named Marshall Delaney. He was writing under a pseudonym named, it was Robert Fulford. The magazine's called just Saturday Night, I think is the name of the magazine. But the article's title was, "You should know how bad this film is. After all, you paid for it," which of course is alluding to the fact that the film was financed by the Canadian government and thus the Canadian taxpayers. He called the film depraved and worse than junk. Like this, it was a scathing review that not only was kind of shit talking the movie, but shit talking the Canadian government for funding this type of movie.
Jeez.
Quote, "If we need to make movies like this to have a Canadian film industry, then we shouldn't have a Canadian film industry."
Yeah.
God.
So that sounds to me, Gary, like Marshall Delaney needs a nap.
It sure does. And he's not the only one. There are still modern reviewers to this day that feel similarly to Shivers as Mr. Delaney. And they also need a nap. Cindy Masters here says, if I'm giving this movie 1 out of 10, I'm giving it credit it doesn't deserve. I had the honor to watch this so-called classic last week. I know some people claim it's the best movie ever made, but don't believe a word of it. It is absolutely the worst movie in existence. I thought it can't be worse than some of the horrors that are produced these days, but boy, I was in for a shock. From the beginning of this inept little movie, where an old man chases the seemingly very young girl around his apartment and doing his best to strangle her, and until the end, it's just horrible. The movie has nothing to offer. Even if you take the year 1975, when this movie was made, it can't be used as an excuse for the horrid movie I know some people call a classic. They're completely wrong. Movies like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, those deserve to be called classics. Shivers is so bad, it must be used in a documentary someday of how not to make a movie.
Oof.
I don't think anyone's ever called this the greatest movie ever made.
I was about to ask, who's calling this the greatest movie ever made?
I really love this movie, and I mean, but nobody's calling this the greatest movie ever made. So I don't know who she's hearing that from.
Well, let's look at Chuck Felici here.
Fellatio.
Chuck Fellatio.
Chuck Fellatio.
That's a porn name.
The title of this review is "Not Worth It at Any Price!" Triple exclamation mark. Okay. This sentence is a little making me struggle a little bit. What did I dislike? Everything. Without a doubt, the worst piece of shit ever put on a disc.
On a disc.
This is from New York Shopper. Stupid. Just play stupid. I guess you have to be a fan of this Cronenberg director, because for the life of me, I don't understand how anybody can rate this movie higher than 1 star. If I could give it no stars, that'd be what I'd do. This is supposed to be a horror movie. So in a sense, I do agree, because it's a horrible movie.
Oh.
Don't quit your day job there, buddy.
Nate says, hell nah. This is disgusting. It's not worth the cinematography or any cool imagery one could derive from this rape fest. Hell nah.
Hell no. He said it twice.
This is from someone named Flags. I know this was only one of Cronenberg's early feature films, but this ain't it, Chief. Zombie movie, but with sexual assault just ain't interesting. There's something to the concept of parasites that are transmitted like STDs and lower inhibitions, but this film simply has nothing to say. Outside the last little monologue about the dream, there's not really much depth. It's a lot of shock for the sake of shock, deliberate offense, and no momentum. Angel Eyes says David Cronenberg's porn version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. His debut film is, to put it mildly, controversial, and I'm disgusted. I'm surprised there are those who seriously think this is a good movie. I do not see the social commentary they seem to see. Instead, I see a director who wants to direct a porn film, but who at the last moment was offered to make a real film for a studio, but then used his porn film for the script. This is completely perverted, and David Cronenberg goes too far. Fuck this shit. Sorry, and I do have one more, and it's Sophie, and she says, it's one of those films that just makes you sort of stare at the screen and think, wow, you really hate women, don't you? You love making weird little jokes about men being sexually assaulted by ugly old women or being oblivious to the advances of their sexy nurses as a comedy relief. Boobies! But you'll put in multiple instances of women being raped and coerced and assaulted for sheer spook value. You're just gross. even in body horror terms, the parasites just resemble wrinkly little flaccid and degloved penises. The actual visual for the metaphor wouldn't be improved upon until RABID. Sad.
The term degloved penises fills me with terror.
And that's our next T-shirt, folks.
The fact that person also thinks that the scene where Nurse Forsyth is trying to not seduce but entice her boyfriend, the doctor, is comic relief makes me wonder what her like definition of comedy is, because that is not what the intention of that scene is at all. That's I don't know. People like to get up in arms about it. I mean, I'm sure we'll hear about, as we go through this series, I'm sure we'll hear other accusations that Cronenberg is misogynistic because what things happen to women in movies, but things happen to men too. And I don't think that he's misogynistic at all. I think Cronenberg is one of the more liberal-minded, most thoughtful directors that we'll probably discuss on this show. The dude is like fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Like I was reading some interviews with him while preparing for this. I got a book that's just it's a collection of interviews from various magazines and publications, all compiled in a book of all David Cronenberg interviews. And as I was reading it, like I told Gary, I was like, you're gonna like this guy, because I know Gary, you're into like studying philosophy and things like that. And I feel like you and David Cronenberg could sit down and have a fun conversation. I think that like you guys would get along, because he's a very like thoughtful, like he doesn't do anything without reason. You know what I mean?
I feel like in some sort of way you just complimented me, and that's very sweet of you. Unexpected. No, I agree. I think I keep saying I think he seems like a cool guy or a nice guy. I think that's why. Like I think there's something extra thoughtful about him, and something connects with me. Every interview I see with him, I'm definitely like, I would love to just talk to this guy. He seems great.
He's super interesting. So that Delaney article in Saturday Night Magazine, it kind of created a snowball effect of controversy. So other negative reviews would end up popping up in several other notable Canadian publications. It was drawing criticism from conservative writers and politicians, while left-wing critics accuse it of reactionary moralizing. And I think this is something that we're going to see a lot in Cronenberg's work as we go forward, because he doesn't really pick sides. You're gonna have criticism from both sides of the political spectrum, because he's sort of politically, I don't know what the best term for it is, agnostic.
Yeah, I was gonna say ambiguous or agnostic. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah,
because I could see how some might see Shivers as a sort of attack on promiscuity, or a reaction to the free love movement from a few years before this. I see where they're coming from. I see where you're getting that. But Cronenberg, if you read interviews with him, he doesn't really view things in those terms. He's simply telling a story about these particular people. He doesn't view his characters as like archetypes that are designed to represent whole sections of the population. He's not saying that like Debbie Harry in Videodrome represents all women because she likes pain and all women must like pain. That's where some of those like accusations of misogyny with him come from. He's saying that this character likes pain. Right? Yeah. He's not trying to turn them into an archetype.
Maybe that's another thing I really enjoy about him. He's just like, I'm just telling a story, man.
Yeah. This is a story about these characters. It doesn't have to be about all of humanity.
Because I definitely saw some stuff too that were like, oh, these like well-to-do, like rich, he's like eat the rich, essentially the shortened version of that would be this, like, oh, they're tearing each other apart in this nice high rise on a island and blah blah. And I'm like, I don't know, I think it's just about a parasite,
right?
Yeah. It's just like, this is a good spot for it because you can't really get away.
I mean, I'm not saying that there's not metaphor within his movies, but I'm saying that he's still just trying to tell the story about this event, or whatever's happening within the confines of this movie.
Right.
But those controversies didn't deter audiences anyway. Shivers became a major success in Ontario and Quebec. Within a year, it had made $3 million, which was at that time the biggest profit ratio ever for an English Canadian film ever.
Wow.
And it went on to gross over $5 million. And then you had some other Canadian publications that started coming to its defense, defending the film, praising the film. One called Cinema Canada. It was this magazine that was founded in like the early 70s or so. It was actually founded by the Canadian Society of Cinematographers as their official magazine. They called it a contemporary masterpiece of horror in their review.
Nice.
Now, its luck in the U.S. wasn't quite as good because it had this kind of wonky town by town, theater by theater release. Remember, AIP was kind of releasing it as a B movie. So it was playing on these double bills with other movies. And often, you know, the audience, it's almost a little too intellectual for some of the audiences who were also going to see, you know, some other like more lowbrow B movie, you know. And then there's this movie called They Came From Within, which sounds like it's a part of that, but then they get Shivers, and it's not quite what they were expecting.
Yeah.
So reviews in the US were less kind, but when it was released in Europe, European reviewers were generally pretty positive, especially after the film won the award for Best Direction at the Sitges Film Festival, which is a film festival that's dedicated to horror.
It's worth saying too, like the Cinepix, they weren't bothered at all. Like in that documentary you watch on Dunning and or on the company, you know, his son, Dunning's son, is in there, and he says that his dad was like super chipper about it all the time. And even on this movie with the negative review that Fulford review, it was just like, oh, at least he's bringing some attention to it, you know. Right. And so he was kind of okay with that, like you know, and we told the story about him anyway, so he would of course, you know, be that kind of person that's like, hey, he just said, you know, yeah, try to shut it down. But that said, and they said it made money, you know, before it even got released, you know, like it was, you know, in Canada, they were already good. They were on solid ground. So they're happy, but it did make the government skittish around Cronenberg, and it screwed him up. Cronenberg definitely says it's like it really did delay my career by a year or two. The review, you know, he wasn't offended by the fact that this guy had an opinion, but it was like, you know, it did shut me down. I think he got kicked out of his apartment too at the time. He did.
Yeah, there was he got kicked out of his apartment because over like a morality clause after the movie came out.
Oh wow. Well, you know, if he, you know, we talked about
probably sucked at the time, but that's a great story.
True. And we talked about this kind of being his film school. Like, had he gone to film school, he probably would have been, you know, schlepping around in smaller, you know, at best case scenarios as like AD or probably just a stagehand on bigger things for at least a couple years.
Yeah.
You know, but think too, I thought where you were going with that would be like if he had gone to other film school, I wonder how much it would have diluted who David Cronenberg is, you know, like if he had been properly trained, like him coming in just as raw, like as this. And
well, and he's not influenced by anything other than what his own ideas, essentially.
Right.
I mean, of course he's influenced by movies and stuff he's seen before, but he doesn't have other, you know, he hasn't worked on other films to be like, to know that he's doing things a little bit differently than they do.
Right.
Right. So one of my favorite reviews of this movie that I found was from a screening at one of those European film festivals where it was playing. And I'm going to read a chunk of this review because I like it. So it says, I made it through the movie in an ever increasing stupor of shock and depression. When it ended, I thought I didn't like it, but a year later, I found myself still thinking about it and talking about it to anyone who would listen. To be blunt, there were a lot of people who wouldn't listen. Cronenberg was a strange name, and my friends were dubious about the Canadian cinema anyway. Still, I kept talking, maybe as a way of exercising Cronenberg's images. Well, I've never exercised any of them. The last scene of the Parasite murders, with the cast going out to infect the entire world with sexual dementia, is something I've never been able to shake. It's an ending that is genuinely shocking, subversive, surrealistic, and probably something we all deserve. That was written by a guy named Martin Scorsese.
Nice.
You've heard of him. He was describing the first time he saw a Cronenberg film at the opening night of the 1975 Edinburgh Film Festival. It was
Sweet.
reprinted in Fangoria number 32 from like 1984. But it's, which you can find on the Fangoria website if you want to read the whole article. It's really good. It's only like a 2-page article. He also describes meeting Cronenberg for the first time in that article. They're like friends now, but he had never met him or even seen him. I didn't know what he looked like. He said he expected him to look like, Igor from Frankenstein or Dwight Fry or something, and instead he shows up looking like a gynecologist from Beverly Hills.
That's awesome.
That's actually what Dr. Kovich does on Star Trek Discovery. Turns out.
So, had either of you seen this before watching it for the show?
Nope.
I legitimately
never.
had not seen it. No.
And Todd, you said you enjoyed it.
I did.
Because I'll be honest, I was a little worried. I was watching this because I have a hard time knowing what Todd's going to like sometimes. But I sometimes, for some reason, I expect, like, especially kind of lo-fi, scuzzier stuff like this, I kind of expect Todd to not like for some reason. Because in the past, it's been true,
I'm a little all over the map.
That's kind of where I went into this I was watching this going, fuck, Todd's going to hate this. And then Todd's going to be miserable this entire Cronenberg series because they don't get less weird from here.
Yeah.
So I'm glad to hear that you liked it.
Yeah, I dug it. And I mean, yeah, it's got a lot of boobies and stuff like that. But like, honestly, I was kind of down for the eerie nature of the apartment setting, especially having that essentially a commercial for it at the top of the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And then rather than it being sort of like the military guy or like some sort of like action star versus these monsters, it's like it's a doctor, like kind of trying to figure it out a little bit. And I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, I liked it. I think the mood was exactly it on this because, like, otherwise, I mean, there's some stuff you could pick apart, but I think he's got like an atmosphere going on in this movie that I really dug, and
which is especially impressive for a first-time filmmaker.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, and I didn't mean to earlier when I said, like maybe he's just making a movie. I'm sure, like you said, that there's metaphor, whatever going on in there, but I don't think it's far-fetched to think that a guy like Cronenberg, like you said at the beginning, or we talked about it, it's a science experiment for him. So also he's probably just intrigued by the idea of like, what if there's this thing? And so it's fun to see him play with that. And it looks, I don't know where the I guess as we dig deeper, we'll find out more about him. I don't know where he gets some of the desire that he has, things. How am I trying to say this? Like things he portrays on screen. I don't know where, because it seems like he had like a perfectly normal childhood. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, psychologically, he fascinates me because the themes that he digs into and the images he puts on screen, you're like, where in the hell in your brain did this come from? Like, what is the trauma in your life that caused this? Or where, from a psychological standpoint, where are these ideas coming from? Mm-hmm. Because his stuff is, they're monster movies or whatever, but they are very much like rooted in realism. So he's not just making a monster to make a monster. They're all rooted in kind of science and things like that. So it makes it feel like they're coming from somewhere within his psyche, and I don't know where. It's very fascinating to me.
Well, and that's what I mean, because like part of the thing I love about us doing these little series now is to learn more about the people, that are involved, or like the person we're following, their story externally, but like through the context of the movies they're making. And I guess, when we were talking about Paul Verhoeven, it was pretty easy to figure out, or the Wachowskis. Like, right. Yeah, I got to handle all this.
Yeah.
But now,
based on
David
their background. So.
Yeah. With Cronenberg, you're like, he's a kid. He liked movies. And I don't know. There's more to him than this, than that.
He didn't just like movies. Like,
you like writing and all of that. But it's like, somewhere in there, there's something that triggered the rest of this.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. This is the only film in this initial Cronenberg series. This is the only one that we're going to be talking about that I had not seen before. And honestly, like after watching those short films and the shorts and the short features, I was a little bit worried because I didn't really enjoy those. They're a slog to sit through. I mean, you can see promise and you can see some hints, some glimpses of talent there, but they were hard to get through, honestly. And I'd seen the next movie we're talking about, RABID. I've seen quite a few times, and I really like RABID a lot. So I honestly had a hard time seeing how Cronenberg could go from what I saw in those early films to what I knew was coming in RABID. I thought that there would be some sort of middle ground, some sort of like growing pains in this movie. Like this was kind of halfway between Crimes of the Future and RABID, but I think I was wrong. I think he feels in this movie, yeah, I mean, it's rough around the edges. A lot of that comes not from inexperience as much as I think budgetary restraints, but I think this feels like it was made by a filmmaker whose voice is fully formed. I mean, he's using some techniques here, like slow motion, for example, he uses here and in RABID a few times that he kind of abandons that as like a stylistic thing for most of his career. But for the most part, this really feels like a guy that knew the type of movies he wanted to make right away and was hitting that mood, that feeling right away. I mean, and many of the themes that we're going to continue to talk about throughout this whole series and beyond are all here right at the beginning. I mean, this still feels like if you're a fan of David Cronenberg's later work, you watch this movie and this feels like a David Cronenberg movie through and through, beginning to end. It really does. Yeah, he'll become more polished and he'll become a better filmmaker, but I think he's like just got the natural raw talent for it. It seems like right off the bat.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean,
it's if you didn't know that this was his first film, you might not catch it.
Yeah, I mean, he's clearly, it's not his best film, but it's a good film, and he's clear. Solid. This is clearly a filmmaker who's on the path to those more well-known movies like The Fly and Videodrome that are, considered his kind of best of the horror genre. It's got those body horror effects that would obviously become a trademark. It's what our whole series is kind of based around. Although they're much simpler here than they'll be in, like the Brundleflies, obviously much more complex than the little dookie penis slugs that you see here.
Right.
I believe we landed on degloved penises.
Degloved penises.
It's got imagine your little pecker with the skin just sliding right off.
Yeah, like you've seen Gerald's Game, right?
Yeah.
God,
it's disgusting.
But it's got some social commentary in there. It's got some kind of poetic dialogue, which is another thing he'd become known for. I mean, I'm specifically thinking of Nurse Forsyth's her speech, about the dream where she says like dying is an act of eroticism. That whole thing. That's a very like flowery, poetic David Cronenberg bit of dialogue there. He's also kind of obviously he's learning to work within the restraints of the small budgets, but I think for what they're working with here, the resources they have, I think they do really well. Like I said, the little parasites themselves are not the best effect, but you don't see them that often, and they work pretty well for the time. Like I said, you can see the string if you really look for it, but if you're not looking for it and you're just caught up in the movie, you're not going to notice that. And I think that he kind of knew that he couldn't show them too often because he edits around them a lot. You only see them when you really need to. Yeah. There are some scenes where they're more up and front and center, like when it comes out of the little drain in Barbara Steele's tub, which the story behind making that scene is pretty fun because they couldn't figure out a way to come up through the drain of the bathtub because they're in a real apartment. So they can't get under the bathtub. So Joe Blasco was like, hey, let's, this sink over here, you do a close up on a drain, you can't tell the difference between a sink and a bathtub. So they just took the pipe off the bottom of the sink and they literally had this little rubber puppet on a clothes hanger and bent it. And Joe Blasco is like under the sink manipulating it. It's like, super low budget. Yeah.
Nice.
But it works. And that scene, by the way, you joked about James Gunn earlier, but that scene is straight out of Slither.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you'll see stuff where he'll kind of, reflect on not having as much budget or CG at the time to do this stuff, or at least like to erase wires or whatever, like you said. But he seems okay with it. Like I actually have a quote with him saying, "Unlike George Lucas, I have no desire to go back and correct it with modern technology."
Yeah, he says it on the commentary to this movie. Actually, he specifically like name checks George Lucas. He's like, "I'm okay with it. Like it's a product of its time."
Yeah, let it live in the time that it existed with all the flaws. That's where it belongs.
Yeah, which I agree with. I absolutely agree with that. I don't like filmmakers going back and futzing with stuff and taking away. Like I don't mind that George Lucas wanted to redo some effects in Star Wars. I just don't like that he also has tried to obliterate the original version from the history books. That's what I don't like. I think if you want to change it, whatever, do it. It's your movie. Do what you want. But we grew up on this other version. Just let us have it.
Yeah.
That's how I feel
absolutely
really strange to like try to take that away. Like I get if you've like worked on something, like the desire to go make it look like you wanted it to look, or like you saw it in your head, but some people fall in love with those kind of things.
Exactly.
It's like even with this movie, I don't think I don't know. There's like it obviously wouldn't please a lot of modern audiences. I think people would get caught up in, just how old it is. I don't know a better way to put it. I could see like a teenager who's used to horror now seeing this for the first time and being like, "What the fuck," But for me, the way it's done now, at least, however I've evolved, like it's perfect that way. Like I love the way it feels.
That's part of the charm to me.
Yeah.
Those old school low budget effects. That's part of the charm of these movies.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of the films I think that we're going to talk about on this series concern changes, both physical and psychological, made to characters, often as a result of advancements in technology gone awry. I think that's something we're going to see a lot throughout this series, much like Dr. Hobbs's Parasite. This was, of course, he had a little more nefarious plans, I guess, than what his partner thought they were doing. But the results of these like technological advances are often disgusting and horrifying, but they also often end up being liberating to those who've undergone the changes. And this is something that Cronenberg talks about a lot when he talks about his movies. He has in multiple interviews that I've read about his filmography as a whole, but even specifically talking about this movie, he said that he's on the side of the monsters. And in this one specifically, he says that he's kind of on the side of the parasites. And I'm kind of inclined to believe him, because the parasites are not like villains. They're just doing what they've been designed to do. Mm-hmm. And one could argue, and this is what Cronenberg kind of says, he says that they're actually liberating these people from their boring lives. You've got like, what's her name? Janine and Nick, their marriage is kind of on the rocks. And then, he doesn't want anything to do with her until this parasite comes along. And then all of a sudden he's interested in her sexually again, and at the end of the movie, Cronenberg even says, hey, from a certain perspective, that's a happy ending. Because he's like, they don't look like monsters. They all look well put together. They're dressed up. And, these people, they were living boring lives in this boring apartment complex. And now they are straight up fuck machines.
They all do look happy in the pool.
Yeah. They're having a good time.
Listen, who doesn't love a pool party?
Right.
Giant alien pool party or whatever. Yeah, it's good.
They're not aliens.
Oh, yeah, whatever they are.
They're parasites. They're just man-made parasites.
Oh yeah, that's right, aren't they?
Yeah.
Well, never mind.
I think that Cronenberg also, he never uses horror just for the sake of horror. Like, yeah, his movies have gross stuff, but he's not doing it just to gross you out, And I think that's part of why his films can be disturbing to people, is because his movies are made with an intelligence and kind of a philosophical eye. So it's harder to write them off as just a silly horror film. Like if he were just making splatter movies for the sake of gore, they're easier for people to write off. But I think because his movies because they dig deeper into the human psyche than most horror, it makes them a little more disturbing to people, because it's it's harder to wave off the feelings from like kind of inside of your subconscious that he is bringing to light in his movies. And I think that's why his movies just feel very unlike anyone else's. And that sort of makes me sound like makes it sound like I'm describing the movie, and it makes it sound boring when I talk about it that way. But the thing is, it's a fun movie. It's probably one of the most fun, like out and out fun movies that Cronenberg has made, because there's this kind of exciting energy to it that you only get from someone that's scraping together a few bucks to make a horror movie. You know, there's that fun scrappiness to it that I really like. And I think that despite being a little rough around the edges, I think Shivers does really announce Cronenberg as a incredibly unique voice in the horror genre. He's a guy with this is a young filmmaker that's clearly got a ridiculous amount of promise, who's looking to make films, like not just horror films. He's looking to make films that are unlike anything else that's out there. And I think that honestly, what we're going to see is that he only gets better from here. Yes, it's a fully formed voice, but it's still a guy who's just getting started.
Yeah, I'm excited to learn more about Cronenberg and see the progression. He's already just the start of this. I'm into this guy.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I'm very excited about this. And the more interviews and stuff I read with him, the more and more I like him. I think he's just going to be really fun to dig into. But before we kind of get into wrap-up mode here, I am curious. It's time for a little bit of further viewing. If you guys were going to book a double feature at, let's say one day down the line, we've been doing this podcast for 10 years. We've gotten so successful that we have opened our own movie theater. It's called the Cinema Shock Cinema. And, and we're booking a double feature with Shivers. What are you going to book?
I mean, I think it's maybe a little bit obvious, but I'll go ahead and take the obvious choice of Dawn of the Dead.
That was not the obvious one I was thinking of.
Oh no.
I mean, Night of the Living Dead, maybe, but yeah, Dawn of the Dead works too.
Because they end up kind of becoming zombies. There's a little bit of social commentary. Sure. It's all in one location. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I could see Dawn for that reason. That's a good call.
The weird one that kept popping into my head, and I think it's because that opening sequence is so striking to me anyway. I kept seeing like the IKEA ad that's in Fight Club, so I kept looking at like Fight Club references, and I think if they had done a little bit different lighting, I think this could easily have looked like something from David Fincher. And I think that would have been kind of interesting. So my choice is Dawn of the Dead, but I also kind of think this might work with Fight Club. I'm not sure why.
I don't know. I don't know that any other part of the movie would work with Fight Club. I mean,
but there's some sexual stuff throughout Fight Club. Maybe more subtle. I think more subtle for sure.
Hatred of women.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, my choice is Dawn of the Dead.
Dawn of the Dead. What about you, Gary?
I don't have one. No, I mean, I obviously we've mentioned Slither.
That's when Todd said I'm going to pick the obvious one. I thought Slither was it, because Slither is, without a doubt, very. I mean, James Gunn has said. In fact, I was looking it up the other day because I was curious if he'd said it, like if he's actually said, "Hey, that Shivers is a big influence." And I found a quote on his Twitter from last year where somebody was asking him if Slither was inspired by Night of the Creeps. Fred Decker's Night of the Creeps. And he said, no, I'd not seen that before making Slither, but there were a lot of other inspirations, the biggest of which was Cronenberg's Shivers. So he fully admits that Slither came from here.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, there's plenty of movies that kind of fall along these lines. What was I thinking of earlier? Oh, well, Lynn Lowry's in The Crazies. We mentioned that, and The Crazies would work. I kind of lean towards Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Well, yeah, I don't know why I didn't say that. Especially the remake, the Philip Kaufman one from 1978. I think that would make a great double feature with this. Yeah. Alien, I guess. Might as well throw that in there. Might as well. So after Shivers, it would be a couple more years
before Cronenberg would make another film. Gary kind of hinted at this before, but that was a delay that he does directly blame that article by Marshall Delaney. He says that stalled his career for a couple of years because it did make it tougher to get funding. The CFDC, they were reluctant to pay for his next film because they were worried about further backlash. But they eventually relented. And in 1977, Cronenberg released his follow-up to Shivers. It was another body horror classic called RABID. And that's where we're picking back up next episode.
Nice. I'm looking forward to it.
I didn't have anything to say about it. Just like those sounds.
So we're going to talk about RABID on our next episode. It's a film that I quite enjoy, so I hope you guys will enjoy it as well. I don't know if you guys have seen it before or not. I feel like, Gary, you've probably seen it.
Yeah, it's been
like you've probably watched it with me before.
Yeah, I was about to say maybe it's.
I've seen RABID more than probably any other Cronenberg movie other than The Fly. I don't know why, but I have. Well, folks, as always, if you want to follow along with us and you want to watch RABID along with us, it's actually very easy to find. It's streaming. It's actually on HBO right now, although I think it leaves at the end of this month. So you got a few more days to watch it on HBO. I think by the time this episode's out, it's not going to be on there anymore, but it's still pretty easy to find. Head to cinemashock.net. We've always got links to where you can view, where you can kind of stream legally any movie that we're going to be talking about on future episodes. You can also, of course, find all of our episode archives there, links to buy our t-shirts, links to our Discord that Gary talked about earlier, everything. It's the one-stop shop for all things Cinema Shock on cinemashock.net. You can also follow us at cinema_shock on Twitter, Instagram, and all that stuff. Like us on Facebook, etc. Where can you gentlemen be found on the internet?
I am at This Is Gary Horne on all the socials. And you can see the NWA stuff I do sometimes at NWA.
And if Star Trek is your thing, please join me and my rotating panel of family and friends and occasional Star Trek cast members for my show, Computer Resume Podcast, covering the entire Star Trek franchise in chronological order for fans new and old, available wherever you get your podcasts, on the socials at Computer Resume. And I am at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd.
It didn't sound like you read that at all.
Yeah,
No.
absolutely.
He has that memorized.
That was off the cuff.
Yep. Professionalism.
I am at Justin_Bishop, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. Again, please follow us, the podcast, everywhere online, and please like and rate and review us. You can now rate and review on Spotify. So if you listen to your podcast on Spotify, go give us 5 stars. Of course, it's always great to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts as well, regardless of where you might be listening. Rating us on Apple Podcasts gets us way up in the ranks, and that helps more than anything else. Or just, send this episode to a friend. One friend. That's all I'm asking this week. If you have one friend who's a fan of David Cronenberg, just send them a link to this episode today. That's how you get word of mouth going, Gary.
Oh, is that how you do it?
I mean, maybe we'll find out.
One friend. What if all of our friends just have the same friends?
Well, no, I mean, I'm talking to the internet though, because there's lots of people.
I'm not like you. I consider everybody who's our listener our friend.
Are any of our friends accomplished pianists?
I don't know. Gary's mom.
That's a good one. All right.
Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
And be excellent to each other.
I had a very disturbing dream last night. In this dream, I find myself making love to Johnny. Only I'm having trouble, you see, because he's old and dying, and he smells bad, and I find him repulsive. But then he tells me that everything is erotic, that everything is sexual. You know what I mean? He tells me that even old keys are erotic keys. That disease is the love of 2 alien kinds of creatures for each other. That even dying is an art of eroticism. That talking is sexual. That breathing is sexual. That even to physically exist is sexual. I believe him. We make love beautifully, and Johnny has the keys.
Let's wrap it up.